The bell over the diner door chimed sharp in the cold, and the small knot of townsfolk outside laughed as Rex sat beside Officer Mason. Snowmelt ran along the curb, and the air smelled of coffee and grease. Mason kept his posture easy, soft smile, shoulders loose, but his eyes tracked everything the way veterans do. Hands, exits, reflections. Rex wore his working vest, patch on the side, handle on top, the kind of focus you couldn't fake. Kids took turns scratching behind his ears, while parents hovered close, grateful for something harmless to smile at. Mason was about to wrap it up and head inside when he noticed a stranger at the edge of the crowd. Not a regular. Hood up, face half hidden, hands buried in a coat too thin for the weather. The stranger didn't smile or ask to pet the dog, just watched, still as a signpost. Mason's instincts pricked, but he kept his voice light. "Afternoon," he offered. The stranger gave the smallest nod, eyes flicking to Mason's badge, then to Rex's vest. It happened fast and quiet. A folded slip of paper appeared between the stranger's fingers, creased tight. And before Mason could register the movement, it was tucked beneath a strap on Rex's vest, right where a glance could miss it. The stranger's hand brushed Rex's fur, not like a pet, more like a desperate tap, then backed away as if nothing had happened. Mason started to speak, but the crowd shifted. Someone stepping forward for a selfie, a kid squealing, the diner door chiming again. And the stranger vanished behind shoulders and scarves. Mason looked down at Rex, expecting calm. For one breath, Rex stayed steady, then he froze. This wasn't the sit-stay stillness of training. Rex's nose lifted, his nostrils flared, the muscles along his shoulders tightened. The friendly wag stopped mid-motion. His ears snapped forward and a low sound rolled out of his chest. Controlled, warning. "Easy, buddy," Mason murmured, fingers tightening on the harness handle. People noticed and laughed uncertainly. "He's just excited," someone said, leaning in with their phone. Mason's hand slid to Rex's collar. Rex didn't look at the crowd. He stared past them into the parking lot at a row of cars dusted with road grit. Then he lunged. The harness jerked Mason a step forward. Rex pulled hard, urgent, nose chopping the air in quick sweeps. Mason moved with him, boots scraping slush. "Rex, heel!" The dog ignored the command, not out of disobedience, but out of certainty, like he'd heard a silent alarm. The laughter behind them drained into confused murmurs as Rex dragged Mason toward a dark sedan parked crooked near the far end, away from the windows, away from the light. Rex hit the trunk and erupted into barking, sharp, relentless. His hackles rose. Mason's stomach tightened as his eyes caught what others missed. Faint scratches near the keyhole, a smear on the bumper that wasn't mud, and a smell riding the wind that made Rex insist on one terrible word: inside. Mason felt the note, heavy with truth in his hands. Morning in Briar Hollow came clean and brittle, the kind of cold that sharpened edges and made every sound carry. The crunch of boots on frost, the soft whir of tires on salted pavement, the distant clack of a flag rope against a pole. Holiday lights still clung to the eaves of the bakery and the hardware store, half lit in the pale dawn, like the town hadn't quite found the energy to take them down. And Officer Mason drove slow through Main Street, with the window cracked just enough to let the air in and keep his senses awake. Rex sat in the passenger seat like a statue carved from discipline, amber eyes scanning storefront reflections, ears flicking at the tiny cues most people never notice. An engine that didn't sound right, a door that closed too fast, footsteps that doubled back. They moved like one unit because they were one unit. Mason's hands on the wheel were steady, and Rex's breathing matched the rhythm of the patrol car as if the day had been rehearsed 1,000 times. It wasn't bravado that rode with Mason. It was quiet competence. Years of learning that safety isn't loud, it's deliberate. He'd served long enough to have scars he didn't advertise and instincts he never ignored. And in this small town, he'd become the kind of officer people waved at with real relief. The kind who knelt to talk to kids at eye level and remembered the names of old men on porches. The morning rounds were routine. A stop by the elementary to watch the crosswalk for a few minutes. A loop past the river road where black ice liked to hide. A quick swing behind the closed lumber mill where teenagers sometimes tested boundaries. Each time Mason stepped out, Rex stepped out with him. Vest on, leash short, posture calm, the dog's presence both comfort and warning. People called out greetings. "Morning, Mason," and he answered with small nods and polite smiles. But he noticed what the greetings were trying to cover. Eyes that dropped too quickly. Conversations that died when his cruiser rolled past. A woman at the gas station whose hand trembled as she swiped her card, glancing toward a shiny pickup parked by the curb like it owned the place. A group of men outside the feed store who laughed too loud and watched him with the lazy confidence of people protected by someone bigger than themselves. Briar Hollow was friendly the way a house can be kept. Tidy curtains, swept porch, polite hellos, while the foundation underneath groans. Mason felt it in the town's posture, that faint hunch in shoulders, that practiced caution when certain names came up. Power lived here, but not the kind printed on uniforms. The kind tucked into boardrooms and back booths, exchanged in favors and threats so casual they sounded like jokes. Mason didn't pretend not to see it. He just worked. He stopped at the diner mid-morning the way he always did. More for the people than the coffee. Because places like that were where you could take a town's temperature. Rex sat at heel while Mason spoke with the owner about a recent break-in down the road, then leaned down and gave Rex a quick scratch behind the ear. The smallest gesture. But Rex's tail thumped once, restrained, happy. "We keep it simple," Mason murmured to him. Like it was a shared philosophy. Routine, presence, eyes open. And for a while it did feel simple. A crisp morning, familiar streets, a dog who trusted him absolutely, and a town that smiled on the surface even as something heavier moved underneath. Unseen but felt. Like storm pressure dropping before anyone admits the clouds are coming. The diner was warm enough to fog the windows, all clinking cutlery and low country music humming from a speaker behind the counter. But the moment it happened, the air went thin. Like someone had opened a door to winter straight into the room. A shy teen server, name tag reading Lila in block letters, stood at booth 3 with her notepad held tight against her apron, chin up the way you hold it when you're trying not to show fear. Across from her lounged Wade Harker, the kind of local somebody who didn't need to shout to be heard, but did it anyway because he liked the way silence fell after. He wore a clean work jacket with a company logo stitched on the chest. Some contracting outfit that seemed to touch every road project in town. And his friends around him laughed on cue, greasy and bored. "Come on," Wade said, voice slick and performative, holding his coffee mug just out of Lila's reach when she tried to refill it, making her stretch, making the whole thing into a stupid show. "You can lean in closer than that. Don't be shy." Lila tried to pull back, cheeks flushing, eyes flicking toward the counter where the cook pretended not to hear. "Sir, I'm just doing your job," Wade cut in, grinning. "Maybe do it better." His hand snapped out, not grabbing her, not yet, but close enough that her shoulders locked. He tapped the edge of her notepad. "Write this down. You tell Marcy to take the no parking sign off the lot out back. That's my spot now." The words weren't about parking. Everyone understood that. The dining room understood it too, in the way forks paused halfway to mouths, in the way someone suddenly found the salt shaker fascinating. Bystanders didn't intervene because Briar Hollow knew Wade. More importantly, Briar Hollow knew who Wade answered to. The room stayed still, conflicted and pressured by invisible leverage, because people had learned it was safer to look away. Rex, lying beside Mason's boot near the front window, lifted his head. Not with excitement, with a tension so sharp it was almost eerie. His body didn't rise, but every muscle carried a coiled readiness. Eyes fixed on Wade's hand, ears tuned to the tremor in Lila's voice. Mason watched too, face neutral, coffee untouched. He'd seen versions of this. Big cities, small towns, different uniforms on the same kind of cruelty, and he knew the moment when humiliation turns into something worse if no one breaks the spell. Wade pushed the mug toward Lila again, forcing her into his space. "Smile," he said softly, the way predators do when they want to see how far they can go. Lila's fingers tightened on her pen until her knuckles blanched, and for a heartbeat, Mason saw the calculation in her eyes. Endure. Get through. Don't make it a whole thing. That's when Mason stood. Not abruptly. No chair scrape, no dramatic gesture. Just a smooth rise to his feet, measured like a man stepping between a child and traffic. He took one calm step, then another, and Rex rose with him, quiet as shadow, stopping at heel. Mason's voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Morning, Wade," he said politely, like this was just another friendly interaction in a friendly town. Wade turned, grin already loaded, ready for the usual dance. Deflect, joke, dominate. "Officer," Wade said, leaning back in the booth like he owned it. "You here to order, or you here to babysit?" Mason didn't rise to the bait. His gaze stayed on Wade's hand, on Lila's rigid posture, on the way the room had gone silent as prayer. "I'm here to make sure everyone gets to do their job without being bothered," Mason replied, calm as stone. "So let her pour the coffee, and let's keep it respectful." The word respectful landed heavier than it should have, because everyone heard what it implied, that what was happening wasn't. Wade's smile twitched, thin and annoyed. He glanced around, taking inventory of the room, searching for the laughter that always backed him up, and finding only downcast eyes and stiff fear. Rex didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just stared, unblinking, a living lie detector in a vest, as if he could smell the moment Wade decided whether to back off or escalate. Wade held Mason's gaze for a long, ugly second. The kind of stare meant to remind everyone in the room which direction trouble usually moved. Then he exhaled through his nose and leaned back with a performative shrug as if he'd been the reasonable one all along. All right," he said, hands up in mock surrender, voice pitched loud enough to travel. "Look at me. Just trying to keep the service sharp. Didn't know we were so sensitive today." A few nervous chuckles tried to appear and failed. The room stayed stiff, still trapped between relief and fear of what came later. Lila poured the coffee with hands that shook no matter how hard she tried to steady them. And Mason didn't shift away until her shoulders unlocked and she could step back from the booth. Only then did he return to his seat, calm as a closed door. Rex settling beside him with that same unsettling composure. Watchful, not reactive like he was filing Wade away in a place that didn't forgive. Wade slid out of the booth with his friends, boots thudding too loud on the tile, and as he passed Mason, he dipped his head close, smile sharp enough to cut. "You keep playing hero," he murmured, soft so only Mason could hear. "And you'll learn how this town really works." Mason didn't answer. He let silence do the work. Wade's eyes flicked to Rex, and for a split second something colder than arrogance crossed his face. Recognition, maybe? Or the uncomfortable awareness that a dog like that didn't just see people. He read them. Wade's smirk returned a beat later, and he shouldered out through the front door, the bell chiming bright like nothing had happened. The room released a collective breath in tiny pieces, forks resuming, conversations restarting at half volume with forced normalcy. And Lila retreated behind the counter without looking at anyone, as if eye contact might break her. Mason watched her go, then scanned the windows, the parking lot, the reflections, the corners. He felt the town's tension settling back into place, like a blanket pulled over a mess. Rex's ears twitched. Mason followed the motion and noticed someone near the entrance. A stranger he hadn't seen sit. Hadn't ordered food, hadn't joined any table. Hood up, face angled down, shoulders drawn tight against warmth like they were braced for impact. The stranger hovered close to the little space where families sometimes lined up to pay, pretending to check the rack of local postcards while their eyes mostly stayed on Rex. Mason's instincts ticked up, but he kept his posture neutral. People moved between them, customers, coats, the waitress carrying plates, enough noise and motion to conceal intent. Then the stranger stepped closer, not to Mason, not to the counter, but to Rex. No greeting, no smile, no request to pet. Just a hand that appeared near the dog's vest with a tremor so obvious it looked like cold, though the diner was warm. The stranger's fingers slid something folded beneath the strap by the handle, quick, practiced, desperate, like they'd done it in their head 100 times and finally forced their body to follow through. Rex didn't flinch. He didn't lean into the touch. He went still, not with obedience, but with a kind of listening that made the hairs on Mason's arms rise. Mason's eyes snapped to the stranger's hand. He saw the shaking. He saw the bitten nails. He saw the way the stranger refused to meet his gaze, staring instead at the floor as if eye contact would invite questions they couldn't survive. Mason opened his mouth. Just a small, "Hey," meant to pause, not accuse. But the stranger was already backing away, swallowed by the flow of customers heading out, slipping between bodies with the urgency of someone escaping a burning room. In 2 breaths, they were gone. Mason's pulse stayed steady, but his mind sharpened. He slid his fingers under the strap and retrieved the folded note, its creases hard, the paper damp from nervous palms. Rex's nose hovered near it, inhaling once. Then he looked up at Mason with eyes that held more than training, something like insistence. Mason unfolded the paper beneath the table, using his body as a shield from curious glances, and read the few words scrawled in a hurried hand. They didn't explain. They didn't plead. They just struck like a siren in the bones. Trunk. Black sedan. She's still alive. Don't trust them. Mason didn't let his face change, not even a flicker, because in a town like Briar Hollow, information was currency, and fear was an informant, and the moment you looked rattled, you became a story people could sell. He refolded the note once, twice. Small, controlled movements that made it look like nothing more than a receipt. Then slid it into his pocket, while his thumb brushed the radio at his belt without pressing. Rex's posture shifted before Mason even moved his chair. The dog's head lowered, nostrils widening as he drew in the diner's warm air and peeled it apart into layers the way only he could. Bacon grease, floor cleaner, peppermint gum, wet wool, coffee, old fry oil, and then something that didn't belong, sharp and clinical, like antiseptic, threaded with a metallic tang that made Rex's lips pull back just enough to show tension. A low growl vibrated in his chest, not loud, not for show, more like an engine idling in warning. Mason stood smoothly, palmed a few bills onto the table to keep his exit casual, and nodded once toward Marcy behind the counter, as if he was simply heading out for fresh air. Rex rose with him, leash short, vest snug, body aligned at heel, but eyes already pointed toward the door like a compass needle finding north. The bell chimed when Mason pushed it open, and cold hit his face like a slap. Outside, the parking lot stretched gray and slushy under a pale sky. Cars lined up in uneven rows, exhaust drifting in thin plumes. The little crowd from earlier had thinned. A couple smokers lingered near the side wall, and a family loaded kids into an SUV. The ordinary routine of life, trying to pretend nothing terrible ever happened here. Rex's paws hit the pavement, and he froze again, head lifting, snout cutting left to right in quick, precise sweeps. Mason didn't tug or chatter. He gave Rex slack, not freedom, but room to work. "Show me," he murmured, a command that wasn't in the manual, but lived between them. Rex moved in a straight line that made Mason's skin prickle, passing 3 vehicles without hesitation, ignoring dropped fries and spilled soda like they didn't exist, his nose tracking something faint and specific through the wash of winter air. Mason's eyes followed Rex's body language the way he'd learned to. Tail position, ear angle, the subtle stiffening that meant the scent cone was narrowing. Rex's breathing changed, shorter pulls. Another low growl. They reached the far end of the lot where a black sedan sat a little too isolated, parked crooked as if the driver had rushed or didn't care about being noticed. Its windows were tinted dark, a thin film of grime on the lower panels, and there was something about it that felt wrong before logic could name it. The way it seemed to absorb light, the way no one parked near it, the way the air around it tasted like trouble. Rex approached the rear quarter panel and stopped dead, nose pressed close to the seam of the trunk. His shoulders bunched. He let out one sharp bark, then another, urgent, insistent, followed by a rapid series that made heads turn and conversations falter. Mason's hand wrapped the harness handle, steadying Rex without pulling him away. He crouched, bringing his eyes level with the bumper, and that's when the small things snapped into focus. Near the trunk lock, the paint was scuffed in a semicircle like a key had slipped or a tool had been forced. Along the bumper edge, a single thread of pale blue fabric clung to a rough spot, caught there like a whisper trying not to be lost. Denim or a sweater, torn in struggle and left behind as proof. Mason pinched it between gloved fingers, feeling how it resisted, how it had been snagged hard. Then, half hidden in the slush beneath the rear wheel, something glinted. He brushed away dirty snow and revealed a crushed plastic card, cracked down the middle, the kind of swipe badge used for access. Cheap laminate, faded logo, punched hole torn clean through as if it had been ripped from a lanyard. Rex growled again, and this time he angled his head toward the trunk, ears forward, eyes hard, body vibrating with certainty. Mason's throat tightened. The note hadn't been a rumor. Rex wasn't reacting to nerves or noise. He was reading the world as evidence. Chemical sharpness, fear sweat, the metallic hint of blood, layered into one brutal conclusion. Mason rose slowly, scanning for witnesses, for cameras, for anyone watching too closely, because he could feel it now. The invisible pressure that came with stepping on the wrong secret. His fingers hovered near the radio. Rex barked directly at the trunk seam, as if demanding the truth come out. And in that split second, Mason understood with cold clarity that someone had made a fatal mistake. Because they'd put a living person in a box and assumed the town's silence would keep them safe. Mason stepped back from the sedan like the paint itself might carry fingerprints, thumb pressing his radio mic with controlled force, while his eyes stayed on the tinted glass and his hand stayed locked around Rex's harness handle. "Dispatch, this is Unit 2. he said, voice even, intentionally boring to anyone listening for excitement. I need a priority check. Possible confinement in a vehicle. Black sedan, rear lot at Marcy's Diner, plate partially obscured. Rex barked again, one hard, slicing sound, then went back to that low, vibrating growl aimed at the trunk seam, as if the metal offended him. Mason waited for the immediate crackle of acknowledgement that usually came with the word, possible confinement. Instead, there was a pause. A long, dead pause filled with faint background chatter and the lazy hum of someone who didn't want to pick up the phone. Copy, Unit 2, dispatch finally replied, tone sluggish, almost annoyed. Stand by. We're checking. Mason's jaw tightened. I need another unit and a supervisor, he added, calm but firm. Now. Another pause, like the system had to decide whether to care. 10-4. We'll see who's available. Mason's gaze flicked to the diner windows. Inside, faces hovered behind glass, pretending to look at menus while watching him. Outside, a couple men near the side wall had stopped smoking and were staring too hard. Mason kept his posture neutral, but his mind was already building a box around the evidence. The scuffed lock, the fabric thread, the crushed key card. The note in his pocket felt like it weighed 10 pounds. Dispatch, run the plate again, he said, clipping each word clean. And patch me to Sheriff Grady. The radio crackled, then returned with a tone that made Mason's skin prickle. Sheriff's tied up, dispatch said. You can leave a message. Mason didn't blink. Patch me through. A new voice cut in after a few seconds. Warm, folksy, the kind that belonged to someone who shook hands at parades and told people what they wanted to hear. Mason, Sheriff Grady drawled, like they were discussing a traffic cone. What's all this about? I'm hearing you got your dog barking at somebody's car. Mason kept his eyes on the sedan. Rex's paws scraped the slush, trying to get closer, breath puffing white. Sheriff, I have credible information there's a person in the trunk, Mason said plainly. My K9 is alerting. There are signs of forced entry. I'm requesting immediate backup and authorization to breach if necessary. A sigh crackled over the line, practiced and tired. Now hold on, Grady replied, voice lowering like he was calming a skittish horse. You don't want to start a panic over a hunch. Folks get nervous. Dog barks at cars all the time. Mason's tone stayed level, but something in him went colder. Rex doesn't bark like this unless he's on scent, he said. And I'm not calling it a hunch. I'm calling it probable cause. Grady chuckled softly, and it landed wrong. Probably somebody spilled something in the trunk, or you've got a stray animal in there, he said, dismissive. You popped that trunk on the wrong person's vehicle. You better be ready for paperwork that'll bury you. Let me handle it. Step away from the car and wait. Mason stared at the sedan, at the way it sat too quiet, too sealed. Somewhere inside that steel box, if the note was true, a life was counting minutes. He tightened his grip on the harness handle because Rex was trembling. Anger, urgency, certainty. And Mason trusted that far more than Grady's folksy minimization. Sheriff, Mason said, measured. I'm not stepping away from a possible victim. The pause that followed wasn't just silence. It was calculation. Grady's voice returned smoother, firmer. Officer Mason, he said, suddenly all authority. I'm giving you a direct order. Stand down. Do not breach. I'll send Deputy Klein to you when he's free. Mason's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, because he could feel it now. This wasn't mere laziness. This was containment, managed delay, a slow hand placed over the truth. Mason clicked his mic off and breathed once, steady and quiet. Then glanced around the lot again, cataloging who was watching and from where. The town's surface friendliness was gone. What remained was pressure, invisible but real. Rex growled, deep and unwavering. Mason's thumb hovered over the emergency call button, then moved instead to his phone, slipping it out in a motion that looked casual from a distance. If the local chain was compromised, he'd climb over it. He'd done this too long to let a life die in the name of "don't start a panic." And as Rex's bark echoed off the diner wall, Mason knew he'd just crossed a line the town's power structure didn't want anyone crossing. Mason moved like he was still on routine patrol, because in a town that liked to punish people for making noise, the quiet work mattered most. He knelt near the bumper as if adjusting Rex's lead, but his eyes were on details. The angle of the sedan's tires, the slush pattern beneath the trunk, the faint outline where a plate should have been clean and wasn't. He lifted his phone just once, subtle, the screen angled toward his chest, and snapped a photo of the scuffed lock, the fabric thread, the cracked key card, then panned to capture the whole vehicle, the neighboring spaces, the nearest light pole. He memorized the partial plate through the grime, 3 letters, 2 numbers, repeating it in his head like a prayer. Rex kept his nose near the trunk seam, breathing in short pulls, growl low and constant. And Mason used that sound as a metronome while he built his first timeline. When they arrived, when the dog alerted, when dispatch delayed, when Grady ordered him to stand down. He stepped toward the diner door, leaving Rex in a sit-stay for 2 seconds. 2, 3, 4. Then returned with the same calm. Inside, faces turned away too fast. Mason approached Marcy at the register and kept his voice low enough to sound friendly to anyone eavesdropping. "Marcy, do you still have the security cameras running out back?" he asked. Her mouth tightened. She glanced past him toward the kitchen, then toward the window, then down at her hands like they held answers she didn't want to give. "They're old," she said. "Half the time they don't record." Mason didn't push hard. He eased closer, respectful but unwavering. "Do they record sometimes?" Marcy swallowed. "Maybe," she whispered. "But I don't know how to pull it. Sheriff's the one who—" She stopped herself, eyes flicking to a man at the counter who wasn't eating, just listening. Mason nodded once, filing that away. Sheriff controlled the cameras, managed. He turned to the nearest customer, an older guy in a flannel with tired eyes, and asked gently, "You see that black sedan come in? Anyone driving it?" The man's jaw worked like he was chewing words he didn't want to swallow. Then he shook his head too quickly. "Nope," he said. "Didn't see a thing." Mason asked a woman at the booth by the window, a mother with a toddler. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to Mason. "Sorry," she said, voice thin. "I was distracted." It wasn't amnesia. It was survival. Doors were closing in real time, not because people didn't care, but because they'd learned caring came with consequences. Mason stepped back outside, letting the bell chime like a normal exit, and the cold slapped him awake again. Rex rose immediately, moving to heel, body angled like a shield without being told. Mason walked a slow circle around the sedan, scanning for cameras on neighboring buildings, noting a light pole camera that pointed just slightly away, as if it had been adjusted over time. The longer he stood there, the more he felt eyes on him from different directions. Not curious eyes, but assessing ones. A truck rolled into the lot and parked too close, engine still running. Another followed, then a third. The vehicles formed a loose arc that wasn't quite a block, but was absolutely a message. Wade Harker climbed out of the first truck with a grin pasted on so wide, It looked painful. His friends spilling out behind him like backup he didn't need, but wanted for the performance. They walked toward Mason, talking too loud, laughing too hard, turning the whole parking lot into an audience. "Officer Mason," Wade called, spreading his arms. "Buddy, you okay? Heard you're out here barking up the wrong trunk." The men behind him snickered. Someone filmed openly now, phone lifted like a weapon. Mason stayed where he was, one hand on Rex's harness handle, the other loose at his side, posture relaxed but ready. "Step back, Wade," Mason said, voice calm. "This is an active investigation." Wade stopped 3 feet short of the sedan, eyes bright with the thrill of pushing boundaries. "Investigation?" he echoed, amused. "Over what? Your dog got a little excited? You know, people might start thinking you're unstable." He tilted his head, faux concern dripping. "Small towns don't like panic. You're new to how things work here." The words were soft, but the meaning wasn't. Mason felt the crowd behind the bureau, windows watching, hungry and afraid. Rex took one deliberate step forward until his shoulder aligned with Mason's thigh. Protective positioning, silent and precise. A low, controlled growl rolled out of Rex that wasn't loud enough for drama, but was loud enough to change the temperature. Wade's grin faltered for half a second. The men behind him shifted their weight, suddenly aware that the dog wasn't a mascot right now. Mason didn't raise his voice. "The way things work," he said evenly, "is we protect people who can't protect themselves." Wade chuckled, but it came out brittle. "Sure," he said, leaning in just a fraction, eyes narrowing. "Just remember, people who don't play along, they don't last." Rex's growl deepened, a professional warning that made Wade's friends stop laughing entirely. For a heartbeat, the lot was silent except for the idling engines and the distant diner bell as someone walked out and then, seeing the scene, walked right back in. Mason held his ground, eyes steady, because he understood the game now. Shame, pressure, delay, and if that didn't work, fear. Wade had brought an audience to force Mason to fold. But Rex stayed locked on the sedan's trunk like it was the only truth in the lot, and Mason knew the next move had to be fast, clean, and above the town's control. Because the longer they stood here, the more time someone had to make the problem in that trunk go quiet forever. The room wasn't loud like the diner or open like the parking lot. It was quiet in the way money likes. Thick carpet, soft lighting, a decanter that never looked touched yet was always half empty, and a view of Main Street framed like the town belonged to whoever sat behind the desk. Everett Price sat there with his sleeves rolled just enough to seem approachable, silver watch catching the lamp glow when he lifted a pen and tapped it twice against a legal pad. He wasn't elected and he wasn't sworn, but he held more leverage than both combined. The kind of polished local figure who sponsored Little League teams with one hand and steered zoning votes with the other. Across from him, Sheriff Grady perched on a leather chair like a man trying to look comfortable inside a debt, while Wade Harker leaned against the wall, arms crossed, grinning like this was entertainment. A fourth man, thin, suit too crisp for Briar Hollow, stood near the window with his phone out, not recording but scrolling through security feeds like he was checking weather. Everett spoke without urgency, which was its own kind of threat. "Let's keep this simple," he said, voice smooth, as if the situation was an accounting error. "Officer Mason has a dog. The dog barked. People watched. That's a problem only if it becomes a story." Grady cleared his throat. "He's stubborn," he muttered. "Military background. Thinks procedure is a religion." Everett's eyes didn't harden. They sharpened. And that was worse. "Procedure," Everett said, tasting the word. exists to protect the public from panic and protect the town from lawsuits. We are going to protect the town, Mark. Wade chuckled. I tried to tell him how things work, he said, as if he'd done a neighborly favor. Everett's pen tapped again. You did something louder than you had to, Everett replied, not looking at Wade. Next time you keep your mouth shut and your hands to yourself. We don't need theater. We need control. Wade's grin faltered, then returned, smaller. He's got a note, Wade said, almost complaining. Somebody slipped it to the dog. The suit guy by the window stopped scrolling. Everett finally looked at Wade. A note, he repeated. So we have a leak. He turned his gaze to Grady. Did you order him to stand down? Yes, Grady said quickly. Told dispatch to slow roll it. Klein's on his way, but I told him to take the long route. Everett nodded like that checkbox was complete. Good. Now, he continued, as calmly as if he were outlining a fundraiser itinerary, we find out what Mason knows. We retrieve the note if he still has it, and we quiet this down before anyone with a badge outside this county gets curious. The suit guy cleared his throat. He took photos, he said. I saw him lift his phone twice. Everett's pen paused. For the first time, irritation cracked through the polish. Then we assume he's already building a timeline, Everett said, which means he's already thinking he can go over local heads. Grady shifted in his chair. He can't, can he? Everett smiled. Pleasant, paternal. Of course he can, he said, and the room cooled. That's why he's a threat. Wade laughed nervously. All this over one car? Everett's eyes slid toward the window, toward Main Street below where the town drifted through its day, unaware of the gears behind the curtain. It's never one car, Everett said quietly. It's patterns. It's questions. It's someone refusing to accept the answers we give them. His gaze returned to Grady. You remember the missing posters from last spring? The arguments at council meetings? The runaways who never ran anywhere but out of town on paper? Grady's face tightened, guilty and defensive at once. Everett continued, voice still gentle, still precise. We built certainty here. People don't talk because they believe it won't matter, and because they believe it will cost them. That balance is delicate. He leaned forward, forearms resting on the desk, making the whole conversation feel like a contract. Officer Mason is not from here. He hasn't learned the fear, and his dog, Everett added, almost amused, doesn't care about fear at all. Wade pushed off the wall. So what? You want me to scare him? Everett's gaze snapped to Wade like a blade hidden in velvet. No, he said. I want you to distract him. Smile, joke. Make him look dramatic. Let the town decide he's overreacting. He nodded toward the suit guy. You're going to scrub whatever cameras we control. Pull diner footage if it exists. Make sure the lot camera malfunctioned. The suit guy typed without looking up. Everett turned back to Grady. And you, he said, are going to send Klein with a posture of authority and a script of dismissal. If Mason pushes, you threaten him with paperwork. If he escalates, you paint him as unstable. And if, Everett added, voice still mild as warm tea, he tries to open that trunk. He let the sentence hang, unfinished, the open loop a noose. Wade swallowed. Grady stared at the carpet. Everett finally finished it, softly. Then we make sure there's nothing inside for him to save. Night dropped over Briar Hollow like wet cloth, muting the town into pockets of porch light and the occasional sweep of headlights. And Mason kept to the edges of it. No siren, No flashing bar, just the steady glide of a man who understood that visibility was sometimes a liability. The black sedan had vanished hours earlier, towed for safety, under Grady's casual supervision, the moment Mason was forced into a paperwork trap and a thinly veiled threat of suspension. And the lot behind Marcy's diner sat empty now, scraped clean like someone had erased a chalk outline before anyone could take a picture. Mason hadn't raised his voice when they shut him down. He'd just collected what he could. Photos backed up, the fabric thread sealed in an evidence bag. He tucked inside his jacket, the cracked keycard wrapped in a napkin like a fragile truth. And then he'd driven the long way home, looping twice to make sure he wasn't being followed, watching reflections in dark windows for taillights that stayed too steady. Rex rode silent, alert, ears flicking at every vehicle that changed speed. Back at Mason's small rental on the edge of town, he didn't turn on the main lights. He fed Rex, checked his paws, ran a hand along the dog's ribs like a calming ritual, then laid the folded note on the kitchen table beside his phone and started building the timeline properly. Times, names, voices, the exact words Grady used. The moment dispatch delayed. The house smelled of kibble and pine cleaner and cold air. Somewhere beyond the walls, the town's power structure was moving pieces with comfortable confidence. Mason was halfway through drafting a request to contact state-level resources when Rex's head snapped toward the back door so fast, Mason's pulse jumped. Not barking, not growling, listening. The dog rose, body stiff, nose lifting to pull scent through the narrow crack in the weather, stripping like a thread tugged straight to danger. Mason didn't reach for his gun first. He reached for the quiet, killing his phone screen, stepping to the side of the doorway, letting Rex take point without crossing the threshold. A shadow stood on the porch, framed by the weak amber of the street lamp, hooded, shoulders hunched, hands held up in surrender. "Officer Mason," a voice whispered, and it shook like it was trying not to break. Mason opened the door just enough to see the stranger's face. Young, maybe late 20s, eyes rimmed red from exhaustion, cheeks hollow with stress. Not a criminal swagger, a terrified witness. "You followed me from the diner," Mason said, not accusing, just naming reality. The stranger flinched at being seen so clearly. "I didn't have a choice," they breathed. If I go to anyone else, I'm dead." Rex stepped forward until his chest was near the stranger's knees, nose working fast, and a low, steady growl began. Not at the stranger, but at something on them. Something clinging to their clothes like smoke. The stranger's hands trembled harder. "He knows," they whispered, staring at Rex like the dog was a judge. Mason caught the scent too, once Rex angled his body, sharp antiseptic, cold metal, something chemical that didn't belong on a person coming from a normal home. "Come in," Mason said, voice controlled, and he moved the way he'd moved 100 times in training scenarios. Angle, distance, cover, observe. The stranger stepped inside as if crossing a line they couldn't uncross, and the moment the door shut, they sagged, shoulders collapsing under invisible weight. "My name is Eli," they said, swallowing. "I work maintenance for Price Developments." "I'm not," their voice cracked. "I'm not one of them. I've been pretending not to see." Mason didn't interrupt. He let the confession find its own oxygen. Eli reached into their coat slowly, eyes wide with fear, and pulled out a small object wrapped in duct tape and plastic, then held it out like it was burning their skin. "This is a copy," Eli whispered. "A backup. I stole it." Mason didn't take it immediately. He watched Rex. The dog leaned in and inhaled, then stiffened, letting out one sharp warning huff and a growl that deepened into certainty. Whatever was on that object wasn't hypothetical. It carried the same wrongness as the trunk seam. Put it on the table, Mason said. Eli did, carefully, as if setting down a live wire. Mason peeled back the tape to reveal a flash drive, scuffed and marked with a strip of red paint, and beneath it a torn page from a report. Letterhead shredded, a timestamp still visible, lines of typed text broken mid-sentence. Eli's eyes darted to the windows. They keep files, Eli rushed, words tripping. Not official files, real ones. Videos, lists, names. They run it through the old property on Quarry Road, the one everyone calls Condemned. There's a storage room under the floor. You need a keycard to get in. Mason's breath slowed, each inhale measured, because panic wasted time and time was blood. The keycard, he said, and Eli nodded, pointing at the torn report. That cracked card you found? Eli whispered. That's from the lanyard. She ripped it when she fought. Eli swallowed hard. I heard her. In the trunk. I heard her banging. Wade was laughing. Sheriff told us to move fast and stop the noise. I couldn't sleep after. Rex's growl shifted toward the back window, and Mason followed the dog's attention. A car passed slowly on the road, headlights crawling like a searching eye. Mason killed the kitchen light entirely. Eli, he said quietly, you did the right thing coming here. Eli made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, disbelieving. It doesn't feel like it, they whispered. Mason picked up the flash drive, already thinking in steps. Duplicate the data, preserve chain, escalate outside local control. He moved to his closet safe, pulled out a small evidence pouch, sealed the drive and the torn report, then grabbed his coat and Rex's lead. You said Quarry Road, he confirmed, already moving. Eli nodded, terrified. Back entrance, they said. Past the cedar line. There's a padlock on a steel door. The key is... You're not coming, Mason cut in, not unkind. You stay here. You don't answer the door for anyone. If you hear a vehicle stop, you go to the bathroom, lock it, and call the number I'm putting in your phone. He shoved a burner phone into Eli's shaking hands like an anchor. Rex pressed his shoulder briefly against Eli's leg, one steady contact, then turned toward the door, mission mode. Mason opened it into the cold darkness, scanning left and right, and stepped out with Rex at heel, fast and procedural and quiet, because now he had what the town feared most, proof. And a location. And the grim certainty that whatever was happening on Quarry Road had been buried for years, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to crack it open. Quarry Road was a ribbon of darkness cutting through pines, the kind of place locals avoided with a shrug and a joke, and that was exactly why it worked as a hiding place. Because indifference can be engineered as easily as fear. Mason drove without headlights for the last 100 yards, coasting in on the glow of moonlight and distant town haze, then killed the engine and listened. Silence, but not clean silence. There was the faint thrum of a generator somewhere, the occasional metallic tick of cooling equipment, and beneath it all, the damp, sour breath of old wood and wet earth. Rex was already vibrating with purpose, nose pressed to the crack of the window as if the scent had slipped through the glass and grabbed him by the instincts. Mason checked his body cam, on, recording locally, and then his phone, where a single message sat ready to send to a state contact he'd reached years ago during a joint training, a clear, concise escalation with photos attached, location pinned, and the flash, drive logged. He didn't send it yet, not because he hesitated, but because he needed the victim breathing when the cavalry arrived. He stepped out, cold biting his face, and Rex hit the ground at heel before Mason even closed the door, posture low and intent. They moved along the cedar line Eli had described, staying in shadow, boots quiet in wet needles, until Rex's head snapped left and he pulled toward a slab of concrete half swallowed by weeds. A condemned building, with a fresh chain on the side door that didn't match the rot everywhere else. Mason crouched, touched the chain with gloved fingers, felt the oil sheen of recent use, then angled his ear to the steel. Rex sniffed the seam and let out a short, urgent whine, the only sound of emotion he'd allowed all night. Mason's pulse tightened. "Okay," he breathed, close to Rex's ear. "We're here." He tried the padlock, solid. He didn't waste time. He used a compact cutter from his trunk kit, jawing it around the lock's shackle, squeezing with controlled force until the metal gave with a dull pop that sounded too loud in the forest. He caught the chain before it clattered, lowered it gently, and opened the door a fraction. Air spilled out. Chemical clean mixed with something human, stale and frightened. Rex's body went rigid. Then he surged forward, nose sweeping the concrete corridor, claws clicking softly. Mason followed, flashlight off, using the weak spill of moonlight through broken windows to navigate until they reached a section of floor that looked wrong. Boards newer than the others. Dust disturbed, a faint smear like something heavy had been dragged. Rex stopped and stared at the boards, then pawed once, twice, then looked back at Mason with a stare that demanded urgency. Mason dropped to his knees, fingers finding a hidden ring pull beneath a layer of grime, and yanked. The hatch resisted like it wanted to keep its secret, then lifted with a groan. A gust of colder air rose from below, and with it a sound, faint, rhythmic, desperate. Not words. Breathing. Mason lowered himself down a narrow ladder into a dim storage space lined with shelves and plastic bins, the smell of antiseptic stronger here, and Rex descended behind him with controlled impatience. In the corner, behind stacked pallets, someone lay on a thin mat, wrists bound, mouth free but too swollen or too dry to speak. Their eyes found Mason and went wide with terror that cracked into hope so fast it hurt to witness. Mason didn't rush. He moved with calm precision because panic could make injuries worse. "Hey," he whispered, voice low and steady. "You're safe. I've got you." The victim tried to inhale and it hitched, a ragged sound like their lungs had been negotiating for hours. Rex pressed his body close to them, not on top, not crowding, just near enough to radiate protection. Then he leaned in and licked the victim's hand once, quick and grounding, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." Mason cut the bindings with a safety blade, careful not to nick skin, then checked pulse, checked responsiveness, checked for visible trauma without letting his mind spiral into what he couldn't fix here. Above them, a vehicle door slammed. Mason froze. Rex's ears snapped up. Footsteps thudded overhead, slow and confident. "Told you the place was clear," a voice said. Wade's, unmistakable, casual as a man discussing lumber. Another voice answered, lower, impatient. The sheriff's. "Then why'd the lock look cut?" Mason's stomach tightened. They were minutes from losing control of the scene. He lifted his phone with one hand, thumb hitting send on the prepared message to the state contact, then immediately dialed 911, and instead of local dispatch, triggered the automatic reroute he'd set up through that contact's number. An old trick veterans shared for when local channels went dirty. "Officer Mason," he whispered into the mic. "Active kidnapping site. Victim located. Suspects on scene. Quarry Road. Request immediate state response and internal affairs." The line clicked, and a calm, unfamiliar voice said, "Copy. Units en route." Upstairs, footsteps moved closer to the hatch. Mason killed his flashlight completely and pulled the victim deeper behind the pallets, using his body as cover while Rex positioned himself at the base of the ladder, silent as a loaded spring. The hatch creaked. A sliver of light spilled down. Wade's voice drifted through, amused. "See? Nothing. Just old junk." Rex's growl rose, low, controlled, final. It stopped Wade's laughter mid-breath. "What the hell?" Wade started, and then Mason spoke, not shouting, not pleading, just letting authority land like a hammer. "Step away from the hatch," he said. "Now." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then Grady's voice, brittle with anger and fear. "Mason, you're out of line," he snapped. "You don't have jurisdiction." "I have a victim," Mason cut in, voice ice calm. "And I have evidence. And I have recordings." Wade swore. Something metallic scraped, maybe a weapon being drawn, maybe just a tool. But Rex didn't wait to find out. He lunged up the ladder in one explosive motion, barking once, a single, thunderous warning. And the sound alone made Wade stumble back with a curse. The hatch slammed shut hard enough to shake dust from the beams. Mason used that second to lift the victim onto his shoulder in a careful fireman carry, then climbed the ladder slowly so he didn't jar them. Rex circling above like a guardian with teeth. They emerged into the building's main corridor just as headlights washed through broken windows. Multiple vehicles, no familiar county markings, the clean authority of state units cutting through the night. Commands rang out. "Hands, now!" Wade bolted toward a side exit and got 3 steps before a state trooper tackled him into the bone. Concrete with a grunt, cuffs biting down. Sheriff Grady tried to talk his way out, palms up, voice turning folksy again, and a woman in a plain jacket, Internal Affairs printed small on her badge, stepped forward and shut him down with 2 words that ended careers. "Save it." Everett Price wasn't there in the building, but he couldn't outrun a flash drive and a timeline. By dawn, warrants were signed, offices were raided, and the first domino fell hard enough to shake the town awake. By noon, more dominoes followed. Wade in a holding cell, Grady escorted out of the station with his head down, and Everett Price's polished smile wiped clean by cameras that finally pointed the right way. Briar Hollow exhaled in a way it hadn't in years, like a clenched fist finally opening. Weeks later, the survivor sat with a counselor and a warm mug in both hands, eyes still haunted but steadier. Alive because a stranger had dared to pass a note to the only partner in town that couldn't be bribed or bullied. And on a brighter morning, sunlight on the snow, holiday lights finally coming down, Mason and Rex returned to Marcy's diner. The bell chimed, heads turned. This time the silence wasn't fear. It was respect. Lila stood a little taller behind the counter. And when Rex sat at heel, calm and watchful, the whole room felt different. Same place, different air. Proof that courage, once displayed, could change a town's posture one steady breath at a time.